There is a particular kind of journalism that mistakes proximity for understanding. Much of what the Indian press has published about Nepal in recent decades falls precisely into that category. Geopolitically close, historically intertwined, and yet fundamentally misread. The coverage has oscillated between two lazy poles: Nepal as India's compliant buffer state, or Nepal as a China-tilting liability. Both framings are wrong, both are insulting, and both reveal far more about anxieties of the observer than the reality of the observed.
Nepal has a new Prime Minister. India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi,
congratulating the newly appointed Nepalese PM.
The piece circulating in the Indian media circles about Prime Minister Balen Shah's Nepal makes several observations that are accurate in their facts, but dangerously narrow in their framing.
In this new phase of Nepali politics, neutrality is no longer passive.
It correctly notes Nepal's new diplomatic posture of simultaneous equal engagement with all powers. It correctly identifies the significance of the upcoming India visit. It rightly acknowledges the Gen Z political base that brought this government to power.
इस बार आपका performance pressure बहुत.
But then it does what Indian press coverage of Nepal almost always does. It pulls the lens back to New Delhi. It measures Nepal's value by what it means for India. It describes Nepali strategic neutrality not as a sovereign doctrine of a confident nation, but as a puzzle for India and China to solve between themselves. Nepal is not a puzzle. Nepal is not a variable in someone else's equation. Nepal is a nation of 30 million people with its own civilizational depth, its own democratic evolution, and now its own political movement of genuine historic weight. Indian media and establishment have long preferred a sanitized version of India-Nepal history. The record, however, is considerably less flattering. In 2015, following Nepal's catastrophic earthquake and its subsequent promulgation of a new constitution, India imposed an undeclared economic blockade that lasted 5 months. Fuel, medicine, and essential goods were choked at the border. The justification offered was concern for the Madhesi community's constitutional representation. The timing, following a devastating natural disaster, and the method, strangling a landlocked nation at its most vulnerable, was not diplomacy. It was coercion. It pushed ordinary Nepali citizens into severe hardships and pushed Kathmandu directly into Beijing's arms for emergency fuel supply. If there is one single episode that crystallized Nepal's determination to diversify its strategic partnerships, it was that blockade. Indian media largely refused to call it what it was. Before that, for decades, New Delhi operated through the Kathmandu's political class, privately called Delhi Darbar politics. The practice of senior Indian officials, diplomats and intelligence operatives treating Nepal's coalition negotiations as an extension of Indian domestic political management. Governments were made and unmade with inputs from the Indian embassy, ways that would never be tolerated if reversed. Nepal's internal political fragility, sustained in the part by the very dependency structures India helped build, was then cited as the reason Nepal needed Indian guidance. The circular logic was breathtaking in its self-serving construction. Nepal's geography was treated as a vulnerability, to be managed rather than a sovereignty to be respected. Its landlocked status, rather than generating genuine infrastructure generosity from its southern neighbor, was used as a lever for economic influence. Trade treaties were asymmetric. transit rights were conditional. Open border, celebrated in Indian press as evidence of special friendship, functioned in practice as a one-way channel for Indian goods, Indian capital, and Indian political influence, with Nepali workers flowing south in search of the economic opportunity their own country was structurally prevented from generating. None of this is ancient history. Most of it happened within living memory of every adult Nepali citizen. The Indian establishment has well-worn playbook for Nepali leaders. Those who lean towards New Delhi are called pragmatists. Those who assert independence are called China sympathizers. Those who pursue genuine non-alignment are called naive or unstable. Balen Shah does not fit any of these categories, and that is precisely what makes the current Indian press coverage so visibly uncomfortable. The Indian media does not know where to place him, and so it defaults to framing his neutrality as a test of his leadership. His domestic reforms as signals for India to decode, and his foreign policy as a balancing act to be watched. Let us be direct. Balen Shah did not emerge from a party machine, a feudal political dynasty, or a foreign-backed ideological movement. He emerged from the streets of Kathmandu, from digital platforms, from the raw energy of a generation of Nepalese who were done watching their country looted by the same political class that Indian diplomatic circles spent 30 years doing business with. His mandate is not a diplomatic variable. It is a democratic verdict of historic proportions. The aura surrounding this leadership is not manufactured by state media or propped up by external patronage. It is organic, youth-driven, and rooted in a genuine public hunger for a Nepal that works for Nepalis. For the classical Indian establishment accustomed to managing Kathmandu through party networks and debt diplomacy, this is genuinely difficult to process. A Nepal that does not need managing is a Nepal that changes the entire architecture of the relationship. That architecture needs to change. The press piece in question and the broader Indian press commentary treats Nepal's non-aligned posture as a kind of diplomatic tightrope, precarious, unstable, and ultimately unsustainable. This framing must be challenged head-on. Nepal's strategic neutrality is not a compromise position adopted out of weakness. It is a philosophically coherent, historically rooted, and geopolitically sophisticated doctrine that serves Nepal's national interests far better than alignment with any single power bloc.
I'll have an opportunity to naturally discuss various issues with our friends in India.
Nepal sits at the confluence of the two largest civilizational and economic forces in India. It is not despite this position that neutrality makes sense. It is because of it.
You are interested, among other things, in getting U.S. support for declaring your nation a zone of peace. Is that correct?
That is correct.
King Birendra's 1975 proposal to declare Nepal a zone of peace, endorsed by over 100 nations before it was quietly shelved under pressure from the regional dynamics of the time, was not a naive aspiration. It was visionary statecraft from a small nation that understood something the great powers have always struggled to accept: that peace is not the absence of strategic competition. It is the deliberate architecture of a space where that competition is bounded by shared rules. The Balen Shah government should formally revive this proposal, not as a nostalgic gesture, but as a 21st century doctrine with new content and new urgency. In a world of sharpening great power rivalry, where the Himalayas are increasingly a zone of military tension between India and China, Nepal's formal internationally recognized status as a zone of peace would serve not just Nepal's interest, but the stability of the entire subcontinent. Nepal should table this proposal at the United Nations. It should build a coalition of smaller nations in the global south who understand the value of sovereign neutrality. It should make this the centerpiece of its foreign policy. Identify not non-alignment as passively, but non-alignment as active, principled, institutionally anchored peace architecture. There is a phrase circulating in Kathmandu's political discourse that deserves international amplification. Nepal too wears pants in South Asian geopolitics. It sounds colloquial. It is, in fact, a precise geopolitical statement. Nepal is not a client state. Nepal is not a corridor. Nepal is not a buffer zone. Nepal is a sovereign nation with a UN seat, a constitutional democracy, a non-aligned foreign policy tradition, a cultural heritage that predates most of the modern states in its neighborhood, and a geographic position that gives it structural relevance no amount of economic pressure can permanently extinguish. Nepal's hydropower potential, conservatively estimated at over 80,000 megawatts of technically feasible capacity, makes it a future energy superpower of the entire South Asian grid. Its biodiversity corridor from the Tarai to the Himalaya is of irrepressible global ecological value. Its cultural and religious significance, where Pashupati Nath's vibration is felt as the birthplace of Buddha and home to 8 of the world's 14 highest peaks, is not a tourism brochure talking point. It is a civilizational gravity. And then there is the matter that the Indian press has been extraordinarily careful not to discuss. Nepal's geological surveys have identified significant deposits of uranium and thorium across the Himalayan and sub-Himalayan formations. This is not a speculation. It is documented in geological literature. What is less documented because powerful regional and world actors have preferred it remained undiscussed is the strategic consequences of this reality. Nepal is potentially sitting on one of the most significant untapped nuclear raw material reserves in South Asia, in a world pivoting towards nuclear energy as a response to the climate crisis and the region where nuclear capability is a central pillar of strategic power. The nation that controls uranium supply chains holds a card of extraordinary geopolitical weight. The Nepali people are the sole and sovereign custodians of what lies beneath Nepali soil. This is not a negotiating chip. It is a constitutional and sovereign reality. No bilateral treaty, no infrastructure investment, no transit agreement gives any external power a claim over Nepal's subsoil resources. Nepal has not yet developed the institutional and technical capacity to fully audit, protect, and leverage these resources. And that is precisely where the current government's domestic reform agenda intersects directly with long-term strategic sovereignty. Nepal must develop a national strategic resources doctrine that commissions a full, independent, internationally verified geological survey of all fissile and radioactive material deposits within Nepal territory, establishes a constitutional prohibition on any foreign entity holding extraction rights over uranium, thorium, or rare earth deposits without a parliamentary approval and a public referendum. Builds the technical capacity within Nepali institutions, universities, geological services, and legal frameworks to manage these assets domestically. Engages the International Atomic Energy Agency not as a supplicant, but as a treaty partner in establishing Nepal's sovereign nuclear resource framework under international law. This world does not need to teach Nepal about its own resources. The world needs to understand that Nepal knows exactly what it has, knows exactly who it belongs to, and will determine on its own terms and timeline how and whether those resources are developed. You have spent decades covering Nepal through the lens of Indian strategic interest. You have described our political transitions as instability, our independence as ingratitude, our non-alignment as naivety, and our democratic evolution as a management problem for New Delhi. Consider for a moment how that coverage reads in Kathmandu. Consider how it reads to a Nepali graduate who watched their country blockaded after an earthquake. A direct message to the Indian and the regional press. To a Nepali worker who crossed the border not by choice, but because the structural dependency your country helped architect left them no alternative at home. To a Nepali voter who for the first time in a generation cast a ballot for someone who did not owe their political existence to a party backed by foreign endorsement. Nepal does not need any approval to define its foreign policy. It does not need your editorial boards to validate its democratic choices. It does not need your think tanks to explain to it what non-alignment means.
Neutrality in Nepal's geography has never been simple, because neutrality is not just a policy choice here. It is a survival strategy shaped by location, dependency.
What Nepal asks of the Indian press is something far simpler: accuracy, proportion, the basic journalistic discipline of covering a sovereign nation as a sovereign nation, not as a geopolitical object in a story whose protagonist is always New Delhi. The India-Nepal relationship is genuinely important. It is built on deep historical, cultural, and economic foundations that neither side should take lightly. A reset of this relationship on terms of genuine equality, mutual respect, and non-interference would serve both nations far better than the patronage model that has defined it for 70 years. Nepal's new leadership is open to exactly that reset. The question is whether the Indian establishment and the media that amplifies its worldview is capable of imagining a Nepal that sits across the table rather than below it. The transformation underway in Nepal is not a geopolitical event for India, China, or the rest of the world to manage. It is a democratic event for the people of Nepal to own. The government of Balen Shah carries a mandate earned in the streets, not in foreign strategic rooms. Its foreign policy of active principled non-alignment is not a balancing act. It is a doctrine. Its revival of the zone of peace proposal is not nostalgia. It is a 21st century strategic vision. Its awareness of Nepal's resource sovereignty, including its uranium potential, is not a threat to anyone. It is a responsible self-knowledge of a nation coming into its own. Nepal has been patient for a very long time. Patient with dependency, patient with interference, patient with being explained to by those who should instead have been listening. That patience has now matured into confidence. The kind of confidence that does not need to raise its voice because it is grounded in democratic legitimacy, civilizational depth, and a clarity of strategic purpose that no external narrative can any longer obscure. Nepal is not a small country. with a big problem. Nepal is a sovereign nation with an enormous opportunity. And it will determine by itself and for itself exactly what to do with it.